Service 2, Chief Technology Officer for DLT Solutions. I have with me this morning Aneesh Chopra, who was the first federal CTO. Thank you, Aneesh, for dropping by.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Aneesh, some questions come to mind about your background as federal CTO. How difficult was it to define your role as the first federal CTO? And were there any particular parts of the job that you especially enjoyed?
Well, thanks for the question. It made it a lot easier when it was the president who defined the role. Literally on day one was the first homework assignment to a chief technology officer. I would say three things. Having air cover by the president was very critical to getting the idea of having a CTO operationally effective. What that meant was it wasn't just a person on a org chart sitting around, twiddling my thumbs looking for work. The president actively put me in the senior staff meetings every morning, made sure that we had representation I sat on the National Economic Council, side by side with members of his cabinet, with the Domestic Policy Council. The idea, the core of the idea, is that we should harness the power and potential of all of these new technologies to solve the problems of the day in healthcare and economic development and security. And that became an opportunity to bring these technologies into new areas that maybe had not spent as much time thinking about the technology role in those areas before.
Now, when you speak about technology, you're talking about much more than information technology. Is that correct?
That's right. The traditional portfolio of CTO in the context of the U.S. government has been around R&D policy, which is really about innovation and inventing new products and services. It just so happens that in this era, the internet has been so pervasive and so impactful in the private sector that a big chunk of my work was thinking about the internet as a vehicle for bringing about transformational change. And so that's where I spent a good deal of my time, even though we did focus on nanotechnology, robotics, and a variety of other R&D investment priorities that were critical for economic growth for the country.
Do you see the knowledge transfer process increasing or being more effective with respect to our R&D programs in health and defense and in cybersecurity?
We're getting better. I don't think we're 100% where we need to be. And I think on cybersecurity, you've got a classic example of this, which is to say, on the day-to-day operations in the agencies, they're focused on monitoring their networks, patching, making sure that they've got the checklist of activities to meet the key standards on FISMA underway. But at the bigger picture, we might be fighting the wrong battle, which is to say, when the attacker only has to write just an itty-bitty piece of code to go after your network, and you've got to build this ever-increasing defensive moat around your data assets, you just sort of feel like you're running a losing battle over time. And so on the R&D side, we asked a different set of questions. Are there game changers that would basically allow us to rethink the problem? Instead of saying, let's protect against a network attack, what if we just simply minimize the effect of the attack? So let the attacks happen effectively, but allow our defensive systems to neutralize them once they're in. So it's less about the moat and more about how we move we call it moving target defense. And a variety of other related, not just technical, but business model ideas, for example, an effective and functioning cyber insurance market. So these are breakthroughs and game changers that are on the R&D side. Some may say they're, quote, in the lab, if you will, but they're increasingly starting to bring the ideas from lab to marketplace. And frankly, cloud computing allows us to do a lot of this even faster.
There's really got to be a shift away from the perimeter defense mentality in order to make these things work together.
Well, that is true. And so we live in a world that is today about defense, but we understand where we need to go. And frankly, I think there's a second little vector here, which is for different domains, the idea of an internet within the internet has sort of crept up. And we've certainly adopted that framework within healthcare. So there's now a layer of additional encryption and security on top of health internet traffic. We developed something called the Direct Protocol that effectively leverages secure messaging and has that as a default standard so that email in the healthcare context between patients and doctors and insurance companies and the hospital industry looks a lot different than you and I use email today. It comes baked in, encrypted, at rest, and in motion.
Well, I'm sure many people will be happy to hear that that's being implemented.
Yes, sir.
Aneesh, there's a phrase that you're known for called the impatient convening role of government.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit about how that arose and exactly what it means?
Sure. I think of this as government with a lowercase g. And frankly, the inspiration, although I didn't know it at the time, I've gone back in history, actually goes back to the tenure of Secretary Herbert Hoover prior to his being president. He had a vision for the role of government in the economy as that of an associative state. The idea being that in the European model, it was sort of a top-down, industrialized, sort of government-driven economic policy. The alternative of laissez-faire works, but there are clearly areas of market failure. And so the tension was, if you didn't want sort of a top-down command and control economy and you weren't comfortable with the market failures and the pure laissez-faire, what alternative was there? And Hoover's vision of the associative state was probably best described in the airlines industry. You know, we invented, of course, aircraft with the Wright brothers, but after World War I, we were amongst the least performing in the industrialized world in production of aircraft. And there was a quality problem. On wings and engine design, we weren't quite where we needed to be, and individual companies didn't have the R&D capacity to get there. So we pooled resources and collaborated through what was the predecessor to NASA. And the wing foils and the engine cowlings that were designed together led to the most successful airlines, the 247 from Boeing and the DC-3, which just completely dominated a generation of air travel. And that happened because of collaboration. So the idea of impatient convening is that notion that if the industry can come together to identify common problems, we can tackle these issues in a far more nimble fashion. I mentioned the healthcare internet protocol. That was a 90-day collaboration built largely and entirely by the private sector. We hired a project manager with a couple of support staff. We put up a wiki at directproject.org and challenged the vendor community in healthcare IT to design safe, secure health messaging standards. And we set a pretty broad goal, and they had a bit of a technical battle royale, and out emerged consensus standards that today are in regulation, guiding the $30+ billion healthcare IT meaningful use program that was part of the original Recovery Act. So the inpatient convening is that benefit of the government at the table but not driving the discussion, encouraging, challenging, nudging, but relying on the expertise and creativity of the private sector. And there's countless examples of this. In fact, that's the framework that NIST has adopted for cybersecurity, more of a voluntary industry consensus model. And we've seen that work in the smart grid and healthcare, and I think burgeoning areas like advanced manufacturing.
It's a bit slower, but as you say, it's not a command. This is not a command economy.
I would say it's more variable in speed. 90 days to get a technical standard is the equivalent of adjusting a comma on an RFP in a traditional procurement. So I think you can be fast, but it's more at risk in the sense that you can't dictate exactly what will happen and when. So there's a level of risk and uncertainty. But we've gotten pretty good at it. NIST, as a federal agency, has now gotten very accustomed to its role as a convener on a lot of these technical issues.
Well, there's still a lot of trepidation among industry as to whether or not the critical infrastructure framework is going to become a model for insurance companies or litigators to take out and hammer someone if they don't comply with some minimum standard.
Look, I think the challenge is we need legislation around cybersecurity. The President put forward a pretty thoughtful approach back in 2011. Congress has to step up. I understand there's a lot of anxiety around information sharing and privacy and how do we set the rules. We thought we put forward a pretty thoughtful framework, and my hope is the political will materialize again to take serious consideration on cyber policy. In the interim, the President's doing what he needs to do. We made a condition on the $5 billion plus smart grid program, for example, in the Recovery Act. A condition on getting the grant was that the utility sector would publish cybersecurity plans to describe what it is they intend to do. That was great to get them to sort of take action, but it didn't standardize what actions seemed to be aligned with best practice. So the executive order and the NIST framework really starts to define what those best practices are so that the industry has a bit of a guiding post for where they need to be. Is it enough? No, but I think it's a great first step.
Oh, absolutely. And the legislation for cybersecurity, I think last year there were like 30 or so bills that were in play. Hopefully something will come out this year, or hopefully early next year in the next Congress, if not this Congress. Specifically about cybersecurity, how did your role as CTO play with the CIO role?
Yeah.
And in what was your specific responsibility with respect to cybersecurity? These unique approaches to something other than perimeter defense?
Yeah.
Is this where you were going?
Yeah, when the president conducted his cybersecurity review, he really dismissed the notion that more advancements in cybersecurity would come at the expense of our economy, and that in fact we could go together hand in glove. And part of that hand in glove was making sure that we had an inside game and an external game that matched that vision. So my colleague Vivek Kundra, the first chief information officer, he was focused on the inside game, making sure that the FISMA standards and the operations and investments for agencies lived up to the notion that we didn't want to have a checklist mentality on cybersecurity, but rather an outcomes-focused mentality. And so that was terrific to shift the focus at agencies. Mine was largely on the external side, thinking about the innovations that could come from public-private collaboration, R&D investment, but also thinking about these new innovative regulatory frameworks, like how we think about cybersecurity in the context of health and education and energy markets, where it wasn't the government's operating responsibility, but its convening power and regulatory power. And that outside game is where I spent a good deal of my time, and we all worked hand in glove with then Howard Schmidt, the first cybersecurity coordinator, who had to piece together all of these moving parts between the actions of the agencies, the cybersecurity framework, the policy proposal with the Hill, and all of these internal and external activities that we sort of met on a regular basis to make sure we were making strong progress along the way.
I see, okay. Very interconnected, collaborative work.
Collaboration seems to be the key for a lot of this, and it just so happened that my best friend on the planet is Vivek Kundra, and so we ended up coming into the administration together. We worked together before, and we're social friends, so that had an instant, and then we invited Howard to the party, essentially, and that allowed us to get along just fine.
It's always easier to get something done if you're working with people that you know.
It's a great opportunity.
One thing that has troubled me a little bit with respect to policy directions and the threats that we face, and perhaps you can shed some light on this from your perspective as being part of the administration in the past. How do we draw a distinction between cybersecurity threats that are national security threats and criminal threats? Because sometimes they come from the same source and result from the same code, if you will. Is that a difficult problem to solve, or is that something that we need to look at? Because clearly, in my view, we need to respond to national security threats, but criminal threats are more of a Justice Department kind of issue.
You know, it's a funny distinction. If someone designed a fake Cisco router, and that happens to have been adopted at a commercial company where intellectual property, trade secrets are the critical asset to protect, but that exact same device or infected machine is part of the DoD supply chain. What is it? Is it a national security threat? Is it an IP threat? And so in some of these examples, the end target or the intent of the attacker has a great deal of impact on what agency responds and which of our various three-letter activities going to engage. But at the end of the day, let's diagnose the problem at its root cause. It just so happens that a good deal of our continued cybersecurity weakness has to do with day-to-day operations that have less to do with a terrorist-minded attack, although that's certainly we're worried about that. Look at the most recent data breach report. The number of data breaches driven by sort of criminal intent and sort of this circumstance where someone's actively pulling your networks is actually a small share of the overall pie. I don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture. as more and more sensitive data moves to the internet and to internet-based technologies, we just got to be more mindful about just the daily operations, how we manage data at rest, and how do we protect it in motion. And this simple concept of keeping networks patched, these are things that shouldn't be, we shouldn't be more aggressive or less aggressive about our cybersecurity posture, depending on the nature of the threat. We should be focused on how to address the root cause of those problems. So there's certainly a legal framework and a political debate that suggests that state-sponsored cyber warfare, has sort of a different animal to it than perhaps intellectual property theft. I don't know. I'm a little less on the lawyer side of that. I see both as critical to the future of the country. I actually think internet theft of commercial intellectual property has a huge impact for our long-term economic success and competitiveness. So I'm not so sure drawing a distinction between lesser problem, bigger problem. They're both really serious problems.
No, the IP problem is a threat to our industrial base across many of our industry sectors.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned FISMA a few minutes ago, and as you know, I'm sure, OMB has started producing a FISMA report,
Yes.
Which is very interesting read if you're in.
Are you kidding me?
Cybersecurity.
Interesting read?
I enjoy it.
God bless you.
But the one of the most interesting things is the amount of the spend of $15-16 billion for enterprise cybersecurity across the federal government. Actually those agencies that have a CFO Act responsibility. 90% of that is personnel.
Mm-hmm.
From a technology point of view, it would seem to me that we ought to be automating as fast as we can to lower some of the requirements for skilled people and take some of the pressure off of the available staff to do more detailed analysis than just checking routers, if you will. What's your thoughts?
Yes, and yes. But let's diagnose this problem. My contention is that this is more of a procurement problem than it is a technological availability problem, which is to say, if agencies write procurements a certain way, they're going to get human beings in seats responses with competitive pricing based on hourly rates of work. If we move to managed services and set prices, there's a concept that's widely deployed in the private sector called activity-based costing and a whole range of related activities that if we began going down the road of paying, securing a device, right, set a price and let people compete over that price. And what that will do is create a natural market incentive for folks to bring automation into the mix because that's how they'll win the bid. If I know there's a dollar value per device to patch the network or to secure the network or monitor the network, then I can establish my own competitive posture where I think about when I can bring automation to the mix and when I can complement with staffing. So this is a procurement issue, and I think procurement will help to bring about a much more accelerated pace. We stopped measuring productivity in government a couple decades ago, but productivity is the key to unlocking all this value, and that means doing more with less. That means setting outcomes-based pricing models and then allowing the market to compete on how to find more efficient ways of delivering the service.
Yeah. The CISOs I talk to are not so much interested in products that they have. They just want to be secure.
Yeah, outcomes.
Right, exactly. So to close off our discussion, could you give our audience an idea of what you will be discussing in your keynote address?
Sure. Well, the highlight is that we're on the verge of a pretty exciting decade of innovation, a way in which we can solve problems. If you sit in the agencies today, you have a mission that you're inspired to serve for, and that there's a new tool in the toolkit to help you achieve that mission. One is to get more money in the government's budget. That may or may not be possible in today's environment. One is to add more regulatory authority. May or may not be possible in the ideological divide that we have. But a third option is innovation, and that often means opening up your data, finding new ways to collaborate with the public and private sectors, and that seems to be in conflict with the notion of security, where you're trying to close things down and lock things up. So is there a tension here? I'm trying to acknowledge this tension, and I want to talk about the fact that there's a path forward that's not either or, but 1 + 1 = 3. One can be more secure and spark more innovation, and I'll share some specific stories about how 1 + 1 = 3, which I hope will be advice to the agencies as they move forward.
Those sound like some very exciting ideas. I look forward to your keynote today.
Thank you for having me.